The Pacific was tense in the early summer of 1942. The Japanese Navy, still riding the wave of their early victories, believed they held the upper hand, convinced that the United States had been badly damaged at Pearl Harbor and could not recover quickly enough to challenge them again. In their minds, the Americans were weak, demoralized, and on the defensive, and the path to complete dominance in the Pacific seemed clear. The Imperial Japanese Navy's leaders had a plan, a bold, aggressive operation designed to eliminate the remaining U.S. aircraft carriers that had escaped the attack on Hawaii, carriers that they feared could turn the tide if left unchecked. They wanted to lure these carriers into a trap, destroy them in a single decisive blow, and cement Japanese control over the Pacific. To do this, they began to orchestrate an operation so meticulously calculated that every detail was scrutinized in their war rooms. Maps were spread across long tables, strings and markers denoting ship positions and probable enemy movements. Officers and admirals huddled over charts, pointing and debating, their faces serious but confident, believing they had accounted for every possible scenario. The Japanese carriers were at the center of this strategy: Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. Each one a floating fortress of air power, each one carrying dozens of aircraft ready to strike at a moment's notice. These were not just ships. They were symbols of Japanese naval supremacy, instruments of a carefully thought-out plan that they assumed would guarantee victory. Akagi, the flagship of the fleet, carried a lethal complement of dive bombers and fighters, its decks buzzing with activity as pilots prepared for the mission ahead. Kaga, slightly older but still formidable, offered a second wave of air power, while Soryu and Hiryu added depth, speed, and tactical flexibility to the Japanese formation. Together, these carriers represented a force capable of projecting power across the vast Pacific, a fleet that Japanese officers believed was untouchable. Confidence in their capabilities ran high. Japanese leaders assumed that the Americans, still reeling from the devastation at Pearl Harbor, would be slow to respond, unable to mount a coordinated defense, and unaware of the full extent of Japan's plan. They believed the element of surprise was entirely on their side and that the Americans had no way of knowing where or when the Japanese fleet would strike. The planning rooms were filled with this overconfidence. Officers discussed attack schedules and aircraft rotations, debating which targets would yield the most decisive results and how best to coordinate waves of bombers and fighters to overwhelm any opposition. Security was paramount. Every message was coded, every movement carefully cloaked, and the Japanese assumed their plans were completely hidden from enemy eyes. Every detail was double-checked, from fuel loads to armament counts, from estimated enemy positions to weather reports. They considered themselves masters of strategy and logistics, certain that the U.S. Navy, already weakened and demoralized, could not anticipate their moves or match their precision. Yet beneath all this confidence lay a hidden assumption, one they did not consider fully, that the Americans were not as powerless as they seemed. That somewhere across the Pacific, in the quiet offices of Station HYPO in Hawaii, a team of cryptographers was working tirelessly to break their codes, to track their fleet movements, and to understand their plans before a single Japanese plane even took off. But Japanese officers did not know this. Their worldview, shaped by early victories and the apparent shock of Pearl Harbor, blinded them to the possibility that their carefully guarded secrets were already being read and analyzed by the enemy. As the fleet prepared for the operation, crews practiced their drills, aircraft were loaded with bombs and torpedoes, and pilots reviewed flight plans that would carry them over hundreds of miles of open ocean. The carriers moved in formation, seemingly invincible, a force to be reckoned with, ready to execute the mission that Japanese commanders believed would decide the war. Officers discussed timing, wind conditions, and optimal approach paths for dive bombers, confident that no American pilot could anticipate their attack and that the U.S. carriers were out there, somewhere, waiting to be destroyed. Every meeting, every briefing, every plotted course reflected a belief in absolute control and secrecy. Yet even as they planned, they were blind to the fact that intelligence was already at work against them, that their codes, thought unbreakable, were being decoded, their intentions slowly revealed. The Japanese Navy, so meticulous, so confident, so sure of their dominance, was unknowingly walking toward a trap of their own design, one that would rely not on brute force or massive surface battles, but on silent observation, clever interpretation, and timing that could strike with devastating precision. The carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, remained central to the plan. Each held dozens of aircraft poised to attack, yet their very strength made them prime targets. Japanese officers believed their formation, speed, and firepower would guarantee success, that they could execute their plan flawlessly, and that American forces, weakened and scattered, would be incapable of mounting an effective defense. And so, with confidence, secrecy, and carefully plotted schedules, the Japanese Navy set the stage. They believed a decisive victory was within reach, that the Americans were unaware, and that the Pacific was theirs for the taking. Yet, in reality, the entire operation was unfolding under the watchful eyes of a determined enemy, one that had already begun to unravel the threads of Japanese planning. As the fleet moved into position, officers debated minor adjustments and contingencies, unaware that their assumptions about secrecy, American weakness, and operational superiority were about to be shattered in ways that no one in those planning rooms could have predicted. The stage was set for a confrontation that would not only test the mettle of pilots and sailors but also expose the critical role of intelligence and code breaking, revealing that the war in the Pacific would be decided as much by brains as by bombs, as much by hidden minds as by visible firepower. Japanese officers, confident, precise, and secretive, believed they were masters of the Pacific. Little did they know, every plan, every chart, every plotted course was already being seen, analyzed, and anticipated, setting the stage for a shocking revelation that would change the course of history at Midway forever. While Japanese officers were plotting their grand trap across the Pacific, thousands of miles away in Hawaii, a very different kind of war was being waged. It was quiet, almost invisible, fought not with battleships and dive bombers, but with pens, paper, codebooks, and an unshakable determination to see patterns where others saw chaos. At Station HYPO in Pearl Harbor, a team of American cryptographers worked tirelessly under the leadership of Commander Joseph Rochefort. Their task was monumental: break the Japanese Navy's secret code, known as JN-25, a cipher so complex that Japanese officers were convinced it was unbreakable. Every day, new messages arrived, filled with seemingly meaningless numbers and letters, but hidden within were patterns, repetitions, and clues that could reveal the movement of the enemy fleet. Rochefort and his team pored over these messages night after night, searching for any detail that might indicate where the Japanese carriers were heading. They worked in small rooms, crowded with desks covered in code sheets, machines clattering as clerks copied messages, and the soft hum of concentration filling the air. While the Japanese fleet moved thousands of miles across the Pacific in confidence, unaware that their communications were being intercepted, the Americans pieced together fragments of information. They noticed recurring sequences, certain number groups that seemed to appear when a particular island or location was mentioned, and subtle changes in phrasing that hinted at more than the Japanese intended. The breakthrough came when Rochefort proposed a clever experiment. To confirm suspicions about which island the Japanese planned to attack, he suggested sending a false message from Midway claiming that the island was running low on fresh water. Within days, an intercepted Japanese report referred to AF being short on water, confirming that the mysterious target of their next operation was indeed Midway. This revelation was monumental. Suddenly, the American Navy knew exactly where the Japanese fleet intended to strike, information that would allow them to set a trap of their own. Japanese officers, in their overconfidence, had assumed that the element of surprise was theirs, that no one could anticipate their movements, and that Station HYPO was far too small, far too inexperienced, to influence the course of a major naval campaign. They were wrong. With this intelligence, the Americans could carefully plan carrier positions, coordinate dive bomber attacks, and choose the timing of their assault to exploit the Japanese fleet's own strength against it. While Japanese officers were confident that their carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, would dominate the skies and seas, American cryptographers had essentially delivered them into a trap without firing a single shot. The quiet rooms of Station HYPO, filled with the sound of pencils scratching paper and clerks reading aloud intercepted messages, became a nerve center for the Pacific War. The team worked in shifts, often sleeping at their desks, fueled by coffee, determination, and a shared sense of purpose. Each decoded message brought them closer to understanding the Japanese plan, and each confirmation of enemy movements added layers to the strategy that would soon be executed at Midway. The Americans understood that timing was everything. If the Japanese struck too early or too late, the trap might fail. They analyzed weather patterns, calculated aircraft range, and coordinated with carriers positioned northeast of Midway to ensure that U.S. forces could surprise the enemy while still being ready for a fight. The level of precision required was immense, and one mistake could have spelled disaster. Yet, the team at Station HYPO did not falter. They had to anticipate every move, every contingency, because while the Japanese fleet carried enormous firepower and numbers, they were blind to the intelligence that was now working against them. The Americans had turned an abstract puzzle into a strategic advantage. They knew when the Japanese would arrive, how they would approach, and which islands would serve as points of support. With this knowledge, carrier groups could position themselves just beyond the enemy's visual range, ready to launch dive bombers at precisely the right moment. In effect, the Japanese plan, designed to surprise the Americans, had been anticipated and reversed. Commander Rochefort's team also knew that secrecy was critical. Any leak or misstep could alert Japanese commanders, who might then alter their plans or tighten communication protocols, undoing weeks of careful analysis. So the work continued quietly, almost invisibly, like the shadow of a predator waiting in the deep. Meanwhile, back on the Japanese side, officers continued with their meticulous planning, unaware that their every message, every schedule, and every movement had been watched, decoded, and interpreted. They double-checked fuel loads, flight schedules, and torpedo counts, confident that no American could see what they had already seen. The contrast between the two sides could not have been starker. Japanese officers moved with confidence, arrogance even, believing in the invincibility of their carriers and the impenetrability of their communications. Americans, in contrast, operated in quiet rooms, their strength invisible, their weapons knowledge and foresight rather than guns and bombs. And yet, it was precisely this invisible strength that would change the course of the battle. The cryptographers' work allowed the U.S. Navy to plan an ambush that relied not on superior numbers but on superior information. Aircraft from Midway and carriers positioned at a distance could strike with precision because they knew the exact time and place the Japanese would be vulnerable. In the coming days, every calculation, every decoded message, and every preparation at Station HYPO would be put to the ultimate test. The Americans had turned intelligence into a weapon, a force multiplier that allowed fewer planes, fewer pilots, and fewer ships to stand against a larger, better-equipped enemy. Japanese officers, still confident, would soon learn that knowledge can sometimes outweigh firepower, that a fleet's strength can be rendered useless if the enemy knows your moves in advance, and that overconfidence can be fatal. For now, however, the stage was set. The Japanese carriers sailed toward Midway, unaware that their plans were already mapped, studied, and anticipated. Every hour that passed, the cryptographers' work tightened the noose, giving U.S. forces the ability to strike at exactly the right moment. By combining patient analysis, clever experimentation, and relentless attention to detail, the Americans had gained a hidden advantage that would allow them to shock the Japanese officers and change the course of the Pacific War. And while the Japanese Navy prepared for what they thought would be a decisive, triumphant strike, they had no idea that their carefully laid plans were about to backfire spectacularly, all because a small team of cryptographers in Hawaii had quietly turned the tide before a single carrier plane had even taken off. By late May 1942, the puzzle pieces at Station HYPO were finally falling into place. Weeks of decoding, analyzing, and testing theories had led Commander Rochefort and his team to a bold conclusion. The Japanese Navy was planning a massive operation, and the target was Midway Island. The cryptographers had confirmed this by sending a simple, clever ruse. They transmitted a message from Midway claiming the island's water supply was dangerously low, and when Japanese communications referenced AF as running short on water, it was proof Japan intended to strike Midway. This breakthrough sent a ripple of excitement and urgency through the American command. Suddenly, the entire battle was no longer a guessing game. Instead of reacting blindly to enemy movements, the U.S. Navy could anticipate them, set traps, and force Japan into a situation where even their overwhelming numbers could be turned against them. It was a rare moment in war when intelligence gave one side almost perfect foresight, and the Americans were determined to exploit it. The next step was careful planning. Admiral Chester Nimitz, commander of the Pacific Fleet, understood the significance of the intelligence. Unlike the Japanese, who believed secrecy was their ally, the Americans had the rare advantage of knowledge, and Nimitz knew that executing it correctly could change the course of the entire Pacific campaign. He positioned his available carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown, northeast of Midway, just beyond the reach of Japanese reconnaissance. By holding back and forcing the Japanese to commit first, the Americans could strike when the enemy was most vulnerable. Every movement was coordinated with precision, from the positioning of ships to the timing of aerial attacks. Meanwhile, at Midway Island itself, the small garrison was reinforced and ready, prepared to contribute reconnaissance flights and provide essential air support. Though vastly outnumbered, the combination of human courage and precise information leveled the playing field. For the Japanese, every calculation had seemed perfect. They had amassed the Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, forming a powerful carrier strike force capable of dominating the skies and seas. Officers debated the optimal launch windows for aircraft, the best formations to intercept any American ships, and the timing of torpedo attacks to maximize damage. Security was tight, communication was coded, surprise was assumed to be guaranteed. Every detail reflected confidence in a plan thought to be flawless. Yet, unbeknownst to them, every move, every intended strike, and every operational choice had already been seen, analyzed, and anticipated. Back at Station HYPO, the cryptographers continued to refine their understanding, mapping Japanese fleet positions hour by hour. They calculated the best intercept points for dive bombers, estimated fuel loads and aircraft range, and identified weaknesses in Japanese timing. Each small insight improved the trap that was being set thousands of miles away. The Americans' advantage was not just in knowing the target, but in understanding the enemy's operational rhythm, the ebb and flow of their readiness, and the moments when they would be most exposed. In effect, the Japanese were sailing toward a battlefield of the mind as much as the ocean. The tension was palpable. The carriers sailed in formation, their decks crowded with planes and crews preparing for what they believed would be a decisive victory. Japanese officers discussed tactics with precision, confident in their superiority, yet blind to the invisible enemy watching, calculating, and planning a counterstrike. For American commanders and cryptographers, it was a delicate balance. They had to ensure that their preparations remained hidden, that the Japanese did not suspect their communications had been compromised, and that the trap would be executed at exactly the right moment. Even a minor misstep could alert the enemy and ruin the opportunity. Meanwhile, every reconnaissance flight, every code interception, every minor detail from Japanese communications became a piece of a larger puzzle. Each day brought new information, confirming fleet locations, course adjustments, and timing changes. The Americans compiled this into a cohesive picture that allowed for precise deployment of forces. The breakthrough at Station HYPO also gave Nimitz the confidence to take calculated risks. With fewer carriers than the Japanese fleet, he could still plan an ambush that relied on intelligence, surprise, and timing rather than brute force. It was a gamble, but one based on solid knowledge rather than assumption. As the Japanese carriers moved closer to Midway, their crews remained unaware of the invisible eyes tracking them. Pilots went over attack plans, decks were loaded with bombs, and every sailor prepared for what they assumed would be a quick, decisive victory. The confidence in the Japanese plan was nearly absolute. They believed their fleet was invincible, their code unbreakable, and their surprise guaranteed. Yet, in reality, their every move had been anticipated. When the moment came for American dive bombers to launch from carriers hidden beyond the horizon, the trap would snap shut with devastating precision. The cryptographer's breakthrough was more than just a decoded message. It was the turning point that allowed a smaller force to outmaneuver a larger, seemingly superior one. The Japanese strategy, once considered flawless, had unknowingly walked into a carefully constructed counterstrategy that would exploit every assumption, every timing decision, and every perceived advantage. By the time the first American planes were spotted on the horizon, the Japanese carriers would already be committed, their decks crowded with planes preparing to strike Midway. The advantage of surprise, so confidently claimed by the Japanese, had been stolen and turned against them. What had begun as a quiet, cerebral effort in a small Hawaiian office had now positioned the U.S. Navy to achieve what would later be remembered as one of the most decisive naval victories of the war. The breakthrough at Station HYPO proved that intelligence, foresight, and meticulous attention to detail could overcome even overwhelming odds. It demonstrated that wars are not only won by firepower and numbers but by the ability to understand the enemy before the battle even begins. Japanese officers, so sure of their dominance, sailed toward disaster, oblivious that the very tools they believed secured their success had already betrayed them. The U.S. cryptographer's insight had set the stage for a confrontation in which knowledge would triumph over confidence, precision over arrogance, and a quiet team of analysts would shape the outcome of history in ways that no ship, plane, or weapon alone could achieve. Every calculation, every decoded message, every late-night effort at Station HYPO culminated in this moment. The Japanese fleet moving boldly, unaware, toward Midway, and the Americans ready, waiting, and armed not just with weapons but with the power of knowing what was coming before it even arrived. With the Japanese fleet steadily approaching Midway, the U.S. Navy moved into position, executing a plan that relied entirely on timing, precision, and the element of surprise. Admiral Chester Nimitz had fewer carriers than the Japanese, but thanks to the intelligence from Station HYPO, he knew exactly where to place them. The Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown were positioned northeast of Midway, just beyond the visual range of Japanese reconnaissance planes. The Americans understood that if they struck too early or too late, the trap would fail, and the carriers would be vulnerable to the larger Japanese fleet. Every sailor, Every pilot and every officer on those ships understood that success depended on stealth, coordination, and speed. American pilots prepared for the unknown, their planes fueled and armed, checklists repeated over and over, instruments calibrated and torpedoes double-checked. Pilots knew that their mission was dangerous, and few fully understood the scale of the Japanese fleet they would face. The crews of the carriers moved like clockwork, launching and recovering planes, refueling and performing maintenance in a rhythm honed by training, but infused with the urgency of impending battle. Meanwhile, the Japanese continued their approach, their confidence unshaken. Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu sailed in formation, their decks busy with planes and crews anticipating Midway's defenses. Japanese officers debated which attack waves would strike first, how to coordinate dive bombers and torpedo planes, and the timing that would allow them to overwhelm the island's small garrison and any nearby U.S. carriers. They believed that their intelligence was complete, their movements unseen, and their carriers virtually untouchable. Yet, unbeknownst to them, every maneuver had been anticipated. The Americans' advantage was not just in knowing the target, but in knowing the exact positions of the carriers, their likely launch windows, and even the timing of their strike waves. This allowed Nimitz to set a trap that played perfectly into the strengths and weaknesses of the Japanese formation. 4 hours, the carriers remained hidden beyond the horizon, a phantom force waiting for the enemy to commit first. American reconnaissance planes were sent out, not to search blindly, but to confirm enemy locations and create distractions, while the main strike forces remained poised for a precise attack. The tension was extraordinary. Every officer and sailor on the U.S. carriers knew that once the Japanese planes launched toward Midway, the opportunity to strike would be limited. They had to act quickly, decisively, and with unerring accuracy. The coordination required was staggering. Radio silence had to be maintained, fuel and ammunition calculated to the minute, and pilots briefed for exact attack patterns. Even the slightest misstep could tip off the Japanese or leave American planes without enough fuel to reach their targets and return safely. On the Japanese side, preparations continued with a sense of inevitability. Officers believed their attack would succeed with minimal resistance. Pilots checked bombs and torpedoes, carrier decks were cleared for launch, and flight formations rehearsed in anticipation of the battle that would supposedly crush the Americans. The stage was set for a collision of confidence and cunning. What made this moment remarkable was not just the scale of the forces involved, but the fact that the Americans were relying entirely on intelligence rather than brute strength. The Japanese carriers carried more aircraft, more guns, and more experienced pilots than the Americans, yet their advantage was neutralized by the knowledge the U.S. had gained from code breaking. As the Japanese approached Midway, reconnaissance planes from the island spotted the fleet, but they could not anticipate the full extent of American carrier positioning. When Japanese pilots reported back, their reports painted a picture of confidence, not knowing that hidden carriers lay in wait just beyond the horizon. Nimitz's trap was elegant in its simplicity. Force the enemy to commit fully to an attack on Midway, draw their planes away from carrier protection, and then strike with dive bombers when the decks were crowded and vulnerable. Timing, coordination, and precision were everything. In the quiet control rooms of the U.S. carriers, flight coordinators monitored the skies, ready to launch waves of aircraft the moment Japanese planes engaged the island. Deck crews hustled to fuel planes, arm bombs and torpedoes, and ensure that every plane would reach its target with maximum effect. Pilots reviewed maps and enemy positions, mentally rehearsing their dive angles, attack runs, and escape routes. The tension was a palpable, almost physical presence. Hours stretched on as the Japanese fleet drew closer, unaware that each mile brought them deeper into a trap meticulously planned by minds far from the front lines. On the Japanese carriers, officers continued to prepare for what they expected to be a simple, decisive operation. They underestimated not only the American fleet's positioning but also the Americans' ability to coordinate under pressure, to strike with precision, and to exploit mistakes with devastating effect. The contrast between confidence and knowledge, arrogance and preparation, could not have been more pronounced. The Americans had turned the Japanese strength, their carriers, their air power, their meticulous planning, into a vulnerability. Once the Japanese planes launched to attack Midway, they would leave their carriers exposed. Their decks would be crowded with aircraft refueling, rearming, and preparing for the next wave of strikes. That moment, invisible to Japanese officers, would be the turning point. The trap was set, and it relied on patience, intelligence, and the quiet skill of those who had anticipated every move. Every calculation from Station HYPO, every adjustment to carrier positions, every reconnaissance sortie was now paying off. The stage was set for a confrontation that would test courage, skill, and the power of foresight against the might of the Japanese fleet. And as the first Japanese planes lifted off toward Midway, unaware of what awaited them, the American carriers remained hidden, poised to unleash dive bombers and torpedo planes at the exact moment when the Japanese would be most vulnerable. What the Japanese did not realize was that this battle would be remembered not just for the bravery of pilots or the firepower of carriers, but for the quiet, patient, and invisible work of intelligence that allowed a smaller force to outmaneuver a larger one. Every officer, every pilot, and every sailor on the U.S. carriers understood that success depended not on luck, but on timing, preparation, and precise execution. In the coming hours, the plan would unfold flawlessly, revealing how knowledge and anticipation could turn the tide of war, and how the overconfidence of even the most powerful fleet could be turned into a vulnerability by a carefully laid trap, patiently and meticulously set by minds who understood that in war, what you know can be more powerful than what you fire. The morning of June 4, 1942, began like any other at Midway Island, but the calm was deceiving. Over the horizon, the Japanese carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, crept closer, unaware that their plans were fully anticipated. On the island, American lookouts and radar operators watched the incoming aircraft, sending frantic reports to the hidden U.S. carriers northeast of the atoll. Pilots and sailors aboard the Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown moved with tense efficiency, understanding that the next few hours could decide the course of the Pacific War. As the first Japanese planes approached, the trap set by intelligence and careful planning began to snap shut. Japanese torpedo bombers were launched first, their formations moving low and slow, intent on striking the American carriers. Yet the Americans had anticipated this, and fighter planes rose to meet them, engaging in brutal dogfights in the skies above the Pacific. Torpedo attacks were largely unsuccessful, as American anti-aircraft fire shredded many aircraft before they could reach the carriers. Below decks, Japanese sailors watched in disbelief as waves of their comrades' planes were destroyed with precision. Confidence began to falter, though it was still masked by rigid discipline. Then came the dive bombers. From the hidden American carriers, Douglas SPD Dauntless dive bombers streaked toward the Japanese fleet, their pilots descending at nearly vertical angles, bombs locked on and ready. Japanese officers had prepared for many contingencies, but they could not anticipate the exact timing, altitude, and coordination of these attacks. Akagi was struck first. Bombs fell through the decks as aircraft were being refueled and rearmed, igniting massive fires. Explosions tore through hangars and smoke billowed in thick clouds, blotting out the sun. Sailors scrambled desperately to fight the fires, to save aircraft, to contain the damage, but it was too late. Within minutes, Akagi was crippled. Kaga, the next in line, suffered a similar fate. Dive bombers pierced the deck with devastating accuracy, and the fires quickly spread. Soryu was also struck, its flight deck exploding under the relentless assault. The Japanese fleet, confident in its air superiority, was now reeling, caught completely off guard. Hiryu, the last carrier, managed to launch a few aircraft in retaliation, but even these efforts could not stem the tide of destruction. Japanese officers were stunned. They had expected a decisive strike, a crushing blow against Midway and any defending American forces, yet instead they faced a catastrophic reversal. The very strength they had counted on, the concentration of carriers and aircraft, made them vulnerable. Every launch, every refueling, every deck operation became a liability under the precise American assault. The battle raged on, with torpedo planes, dive bombers, and fighters engaging in deadly choreography above the Pacific. The roar of engines, the staccato of anti-aircraft fire, and the thunder of explosions created a hellish soundscape that contrasted sharply with the calm intelligence work that had made the ambush possible. U.S. pilots pressed their attacks with courage and precision, striking from unexpected angles and exploiting every flaw in Japanese timing. The hidden advantage provided by Station HYPO's intelligence proved decisive. Japanese carriers burned, listing, and eventually sank, taking with them thousands of aircraft and hundreds of sailors. Officers who had been confident in their invincibility now faced a reality they could hardly comprehend. Their fleet, the pride of the Imperial Japanese Navy, was being destroyed before they could mount an effective defense. On the American side, the carriers, though outnumbered, remained operational, launching additional waves of dive bombers and fighters at critical moments. Coordination between pilots, carrier crews, and intelligence officers ensured that every strike counted, every movement anticipated, and every risk calculated. By the afternoon, the tide of battle was clear. The Japanese fleet had suffered losses that were impossible to recover from in the short term. Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu were gone, Hiryu would follow later, and the remaining ships were forced into retreat. Japanese officers faced the shocking realization that their meticulous planning, their confidence in secrecy, and their superior numbers had been nullified by the combination of foresight, intelligence, and timing. The Battle of Midway was not just a clash of ships and planes. It was a confrontation between overconfidence and careful preparation, arrogance and anticipation. The Americans had turned the Japanese Navy's strength against itself, exploiting the very assets that had been designed to secure victory. Casualties were heavy on both sides, but the psychological impact on the Japanese command was immeasurable. Officers who had once believed the Americans were weak and unprepared now confronted the reality that the U.S. Navy had anticipated every move, understood every plan, and executed with deadly precision. By evening, Hiryu attempted one final counterstrike, launching aircraft to attack the remaining U.S. carriers. The assault caused damage to the Yorktown, but it was insufficient to alter the outcome. American pilots, relying on intelligence and coordination, intercepted most of the attack, and Hiryu itself was later sunk in a decisive follow-up strike. The battle was over. The Japanese Navy, once confident in its ability to dominate the Pacific, had suffered a catastrophic defeat, losing 4 carriers and hundreds of aircraft. American officers and pilots, though fewer in number, had leveraged knowledge, timing, and planning to achieve a victory that would turn the tide of the Pacific War. The impact of Midway extended far beyond the immediate losses. Japanese officers were shocked not only by the destruction but by the realization that their communications and plans had been compromised. The belief that secrecy guaranteed success was shattered. In the quiet aftermath, as the smoke cleared and the surviving Japanese ships retreated, the significance of intelligence and foresight became undeniable. The cryptographers at Station HYPO, whose work had guided every strike and every maneuver, had orchestrated a victory without firing a single shot themselves. The battle proved that in war brains could triumph over brute force, that timing and anticipation could decide the fate of empires, and that overconfidence could be as deadly as enemy fire. As American pilots returned to their carriers, exhausted and triumphant, and officers counted the wreckage of the Japanese fleet, it became clear that Midway was a turning point. The Japanese Navy's aura of invincibility had been shattered, morale shaken, and the strategic initiative passed to the United States. For the first time in the Pacific, Japanese officers faced the shocking reality that they were not invulnerable, that their assumptions about the Americans were dangerously flawed, and that intelligence could alter the course of a battle before a single shot was fired. Midway demonstrated the power of planning, anticipation, and precise execution. It showed that courage alone was not enough. Success required knowledge, coordination, and the ability to turn the enemy's strengths into weaknesses. The battle would be remembered not just for the destruction of carriers and planes, but for the dramatic reversal of expectations, the shock experienced by Japanese officers, and the quiet, unseen hand of American intelligence that had shaped every moment. As the sun set over the Pacific, smoke rising from the shattered decks of Japanese carriers, the United States had achieved a victory that was as strategic as it was symbolic. Japanese officers would carry the memory of Midway as a stark lesson. Overconfidence and secrecy are no guarantee of success, and a clever, informed enemy can strike with devastating effect. In the end, Midway was more than a battle. It was a turning point, a moment where intelligence, courage, and precise timing overcame superior numbers and shattered the illusion of invincibility, forever changing the trajectory of the Pacific War. The smoke from Midway had barely cleared when the full weight of the disaster began to sink in for the Japanese Navy. Officers who had once prided themselves on meticulous planning and strategic superiority now faced a shocking reality. Their carriers, the pride of the fleet, had been destroyed in a matter of hours. Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, 4 massive floating airfields that had seemed invincible, were gone, taking with them hundreds of aircraft and experienced pilots. Japanese admirals, sitting in planning rooms that just weeks earlier had been filled with confident discussion and precise plotting, were now faced with chaos. Communications were frantically sent, ships repositioned, and the scale of the loss slowly documented. There was no sugarcoating it. The Pacific, once considered almost entirely under Japanese control, now looked far more precarious. The realization cut deep. Overconfidence, assumptions about enemy weakness, and the belief that their codes were unbreakable had led them straight into an ambush. Even the most seasoned officers struggled to process how a smaller American force had inflicted such devastating losses. They had believed the Americans were still weak after Pearl Harbor, that their carriers were scattered and underprepared. They had assumed the element of surprise was entirely theirs. Instead, the U.S. Navy had anticipated their every move, hidden its strength, and struck with precision at the exact moment of maximum vulnerability. The shock reverberated through the ranks. Pilots who survived the attacks recounted how American dive bombers had appeared almost out of nowhere, how waves of aircraft had descended on the Japanese carriers with deadly timing, and how little they could do to defend ships that were already committed to Midway's attack. On the strategic level, Japanese officers were forced to reconsider their position in the Pacific. The losses at Midway meant a permanent reduction in carrier-based air power. The momentum they had gained after Pearl Harbor was slowed, and the assumption that Japan could easily dominate the Pacific no longer held. Each lost carrier was more than a ship. It was a center of air operations, a key to maintaining control over vast stretches of ocean. Rebuilding would take months, if not years, and during that time the Americans could gain an advantage that Japan could not easily reverse. Meanwhile, American forces absorbed the shock of their own success, though tempered by the losses of their own pilots and the damage to Yorktown. There was relief, certainly, but also a recognition of the precarious balance of naval warfare. The victory at Midway was not just about planes or ships. It was about timing, intelligence, and the ability to anticipate enemy moves. The cryptographers at Station HYPO, who had worked tirelessly to break Japanese codes and track their fleet movements, were quietly celebrated. Their efforts had turned a potentially desperate defense into a decisive victory, demonstrating the critical importance of intelligence in modern warfare. For the Japanese, the shock was compounded by the realization that their communications had been compromised. The codes they had believed unbreakable had been read, their plans anticipated, and their fleet exposed. Officers faced the humbling knowledge that meticulous planning and operational superiority could be undone not by brute force, but by a quiet team of analysts working behind the scenes. The loss at Midway also shook confidence in the fleet's leadership. Decisions that had seemed sound in theory, approach routes, timing of strikes, coordination between carriers, had failed when confronted with the reality of an informed enemy. Officers who had laughed at American logistics, underestimated their pilots, and scoffed at their intelligence capabilities now had to reconcile with a level of enemy cunning they had not anticipated. On the home front, Japanese media and propaganda initially downplayed the significance of Midway, but within the military the truth was undeniable. The shock among officers and sailors was immense. There was anger, disbelief, and a desperate need to rebuild morale and operational capacity. But the lesson was clear. Overconfidence and assumptions of enemy weakness could be fatal, and secrecy alone could not guarantee victory. For the United States, Midway became a turning point. The Americans gained not only a tactical victory but a strategic momentum that shifted the balance in the Pacific. The victory demonstrated the importance of intelligence, preparation, and timing, showing that even a smaller, outnumbered force could prevail when armed with knowledge and foresight. In the aftermath, Japanese officers were forced to rethink their approach to naval warfare. No longer could they assume surprise and secrecy would secure success. The lessons of Midway would shape future planning, strategy, and even the psychological approach to battles that lay ahead. Yet the human cost was undeniable. Thousands of sailors and pilots were lost on both sides, ships destroyed, and aircraft obliterated in a matter of hours. The Pacific had been reshaped, and the Japanese Navy had learned, in the harshest terms, the dangers of arrogance and underestimating the enemy. The consequences of Midway went far beyond the immediate battle. For Japanese officers, the loss of carriers meant a permanent reduction in operational reach, a blow to morale, and a forced reconsideration of the assumptions that had guided their strategy since Pearl Harbor. For the Americans, it was proof that intelligence, courage, and precise execution could overcome numerical disadvantage, and that the momentum in the Pacific could shift with the right combination of knowledge and timing. Midway left a legacy of shock, adjustment, and strategic recalibration. Japanese officers would carry the memory of the disaster as a reminder that no plan is flawless, no code unbreakable, and no enemy to be underestimated. Meanwhile, the Americans had proven that patience, intelligence, and careful coordination could turn even the most formidable enemy into a vulnerable target. The battle was more than a clash of ships and planes. It was a confrontation between arrogance and foresight, overconfidence and careful planning. It was a lesson in how understanding the enemy, anticipating their moves, and striking at the moment of maximum advantage could determine the course of a war. In the quiet months after Midway, Japanese officers would rebuild, re-strategize, and rearm, but the psychological and material impact of the battle lingered. The Pacific would never again see the Japanese Navy as invincible, and Midway would stand as a stark reminder that even the most confident plans could be undone by knowledge, timing, and the courage to act decisively. The shock at Midway reshaped the Pacific War, proving that in modern warfare, intelligence and anticipation can be just as powerful as fleets, firepower, and courage. The Japanese officers who had once scoffed at U.S. capabilities learned a lesson they would never forget. Underestimating an informed enemy can turn a seemingly perfect plan into a catastrophic defeat, and the most carefully laid strategy is only as strong as the assumptions upon which it rests. Midway was more than just a battle. It was a lesson written across the Pacific in fire, smoke, and shattered decks. For Japanese officers, the shock of losing 4 carriers and hundreds of planes was compounded by an even deeper realization. Their assumptions about the Americans had been catastrophically wrong. They had believed that secrecy and superior numbers guaranteed success, that the Americans were too weak and disorganized to anticipate their moves. But the events of June 4, 1942, proved otherwise. The quiet work of American cryptographers at Station HYPO had changed everything. Commander Rochefort and his team had spent weeks decoding Japanese communications, testing theories, and piecing together the puzzle of the Japanese plan. They had discovered that Midway was the target, not through force or firepower, but through patient observation, clever experimentation, and the relentless pursuit of patterns. This intelligence allowed Admiral Nimitz to position his carriers with precision, timing the release of dive bombers to strike when Japanese decks were crowded and vulnerable. It was a victory of knowledge over arrogance, preparation over assumption, and insight over sheer numbers. The consequences were immediate and lasting. Japanese officers had to confront the reality that their carriers, symbols of national pride and tactical superiority, could be destroyed in hours if the enemy anticipated their moves. The psychological blow was enormous. Confidence had turned to caution, planning to reconsideration, and arrogance to humility. Midway forced a strategic reckoning. The Japanese Navy could no longer assume the Pacific was theirs for the taking. The loss of carriers meant a permanent reduction in air power, a slower tempo of operations, and a fleet forever wary of invisible intelligence lurking in the shadows. For the Americans, the victory was both inspiring and humbling. Though outnumbered, they had leveraged knowledge and foresight to overcome what seemed like an insurmountable challenge. Pilots and sailors understood that courage and skill mattered, but so did timing, preparation, and anticipation. The Battle of Midway became a case study in how intelligence could shape outcomes before a single shot was fired. It showed that a smaller, informed force could manipulate the strengths of a larger opponent, turning overconfidence into vulnerability. Beyond the immediate tactical and strategic impact, Midway also highlighted the human side of warfare. The Japanese officers had meticulously planned every detail, yet a hidden variable, a group of American codebreakers, had rewritten the outcome. It underscored that no plan, no matter how thorough, is immune to unseen factors and that flexibility and adaptation are as crucial as firepower. The Americans, on the other hand, demonstrated the power of teamwork, trust in intelligence, and precise execution under pressure. Every pilot, every carrier crew, every clerk in Station HYPO had played a role in the outcome. The battle proved that wars are not won solely by superior numbers or brute force. They are often won by those who anticipate, adapt, and act decisively at the right moment. For historians and strategists, the lessons of Midway resonate to this day. Overconfidence can blind even the most experienced officers, while careful observation and intelligence can create disproportionate advantages. The battle stands as a reminder that knowledge is a weapon in itself, and that understanding the enemy can turn the tide of conflict in ways that sheer strength cannot. For the Japanese Navy, the aftermath of Midway led to deep reflection and urgent recalibration. Officers had to rebuild morale, reassess strategies, and accept that the Americans were a formidable, adaptive opponent. It was a humbling experience that would shape subsequent operations in the Pacific, instilling caution where there had once been certainty. Meanwhile, American forces seized the psychological and strategic advantage. Midway allowed them to regain momentum in the Pacific, demonstrating that intelligence, courage, and precision could offset numerical disadvantage. It was a turning point not just in the course of the war, but in the understanding of modern naval strategy. Midway also highlighted the interplay between human decision-making and technology. While carriers, planes, and weapons were critical, it was the information guiding their use that made the difference. The Japanese had relied on numbers and firepower, assuming that secrecy was enough. The Americans relied on knowledge and timing, proving that anticipating the enemy's moves can be more powerful than the largest fleet or the deadliest weapon. In the end, Midway became more than a battle. it became a lesson etched into history. Japanese officers would carry the memory of their shock and loss as a warning against arrogance and underestimation. The Americans would remember the power of intelligence and foresight, and the critical importance of preparation, patience, and precise execution. The story of Midway demonstrates that in warfare, victory is often determined long before the first shot is fired. It lies in the ability to see what others cannot, to anticipate what others take for granted, and to act with precision when the moment arrives. As the smoke cleared over the Pacific and the surviving ships sailed on, one truth was undeniable: Midway had rewritten the balance of power. It had shown that even the most confident officers, commanding the most powerful fleet, could be undone by invisible hands guided by knowledge. And for the Americans, it had proven that courage combined with intelligence could overcome almost any obstacle. Midway, with its lessons of shock adaptation and the unseen power of information, would forever stand as a turning point, a dramatic reminder that in war foresight can be just as lethal as firepower, and that arrogance is often a fleet's most dangerous enemy.